The first thing I think of when I think of Al Capone is bravado.
Valentine's Day, 14th of February, we have one of the most notorious mass murders in American history.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre is the final battle in a long-running feud between the Capone outfit and the North Side Gang, in which Al Capone ostensibly sends a number of his men to murder George Bugs Moran.
A Cadillac draws up outside a garage in the Lincoln Park area of Chicago. Out step two people dressed in police uniform and two people in ordinary suits. The people in the police uniforms are carrying shotguns.
They line them up against the wall. They are about to sort of ostensibly frisk them when all of a sudden they open fire with machine guns, leaving pools of blood and 7 dead bodies behind.
One person survives for a couple of hours but cannot identify who it was that carried out the murder. It's generally thought that the murder was actually carried out by the Capone gang in retaliation for the hijacking of lorry load of booze, which was stolen by Bugs Moran's gang, with whom Capone was at a semi-war. Over the next couple of months, there's an investigation into this. No one is convicted. Now, the significance of this is generally that it's regarded as the turning point in Capone's career. This is the time where his real brutality comes to the fore, and we start to think of him less as a good Robin Hood and more of an extraordinarily violent criminal. The fact of the matter is that it's not really certain that he carried out this crime. The chances are he probably did, but it's by no means certain. But really the takeaways from that should be not so much that this is an incredibly violent crime, but the fact that it catapults Capone into the headlines nationwide. He's already fairly well known. By the end of this, he's very, very well known. So Valentine's Day Massacre, in many ways, is a watershed in American criminal history.
Those photos are very gruesome. They demonstrate the full brutality of the attack. This wasn't just an execution, it was a wholesale massacre.
Capone becomes public enemy number one. Capone is the target that must be eliminated.
At the end of the 19th century, America is going through a number of radical changes. Since the end of Reconstruction, America has been in the Gilded Age, in which you see rapid industrial expansion, rapid urban expansion, and dramatic changes in the politics, culture, and society of the United States.
We see America going from a very, very rural economy to a massive industrial economy, really after the American Civil War. One of the main results of this is the fact that they need cheap, compliant labor. This is where we see the massive immigration period from 1890 to 1914. We're looking at anything up to 1 million people coming in a year, and this is a population of 80 million in the entire United States.
Whereas in the early 19th century, most immigrants were Northwestern Europe, mostly German, Irish. By the time the Capone started arriving, that's when the new immigrants started arriving. This was the term used to refer to immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the Russian Empire, various parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and of course, Italy.
The result of this is that there are all sorts of tensions within American society.
And a lot of competition in these rapidly growing environments.
American society defines itself as being urban against rural, it defines itself as being poor against rich, working man against the bosses. But most importantly, I would argue, over this period, we look at this differentiation along the lines of immigrant and native born.
Capone is born in 1899 in Brooklyn, New York. He is the fourth of the Capone children, and he's the second one to have been born in the United States.
Both his parents were immigrants from Naples. His father was a barber. They were living in an impoverished part of Brooklyn, though his father wasn't doing too badly.
As far as we know, Al grew up and was a relatively good student, but he was a fighter. He would often get into scraps with local kids, and in particular with other groups of kids from rival sort of ethnic groups. One particularly famous story is one where he leads a group of Italian children to fight off the local Irish kids who had been harassing Italian washerwomen. And apparently he goes through the neighborhood with one of the washer tubs that they use, banging it like a drum to lead his small little army against the Irish kids.
He goes to school until he's 14 when he drops out. He then starts to play around on the streets, beginning as a sort of street punk, then graduates to a gopher for a gang. By the age of 16, he's actually working with the 5 Points gang, and he's a pimp, come enforcer, come bouncer.
His father tries to keep him away from crime, and in particular away from the influence of his older brother Ralph, who is more involved in these things, and actually sets him up as a shoe shine. He sends him to the corner of Union and Columbia, which was a very busy intersection in Brooklyn, to try and get him sort of involved with a decent sort of job. But Al actually sort of devolves into crime because he sets up a local racket where he manages to get protection money for the other shoe shines who try to set up there as well. It doesn't last very long. Pretty soon he's much more involved in the life of crime, particularly in Manhattan, but also around various different places in Brooklyn. The Harvard Inn is an establishment run by Frankie Yale and is based in Coney Island, which is in southern Brooklyn. It is a very interesting sort of place because it is really where Al Capone really establishes himself as a criminal. Frankie Yale brings him in and sets him up as a bouncer, ostensibly. So he's there to sort of break up fights. He's there to take advantage of his big burly size, to throw his weight around, try and get money owed from debts. And it's a very interesting sort of place because it's where Al Capone will get his very famous scar.
Capone hated the nickname Scarface. He had 2 bad scars on the left-hand side of his face. These were the result of a scrap, a pretty bad knife fight with a man while he was still in New York. Apparently Capone had started chatting up his girlfriend, and the man had drawn a knife and slashed him down the side of his face and also stabbed him in the neck. Capone was pretty lucky to survive that, but he hated the whole idea of Scarface. He hated the connotations of it. He would quite often use powder to try and disguise the scars, and he would only have himself photographed from the right-hand side. But what's interesting about Scarface is that it shows us the way in which criminals at this point have changed. Gangsters in the 1860s, 1870s would proudly show off their scars. They would be happy to show their war wounds. They would be happy to sort of, show this is I'm tough, this means don't mess with me. Capone was different. Capone wanted to be accepted. He did not want to have those scars in any way to be prominent, and he certainly wouldn't want them to be kind of associated with his business dealings. Capone is interesting in this light because he shows the way in which the criminal has shifted. The criminal is no longer the gangman of the 1860s, 1870s. He doesn't dress in a peculiar way to distinguish himself. He no longer wants to kind of, proudly show off his record of violence or his times spent in prison. These are no longer badges of honor. These are badges of stupidity at this point in time.
He leaves for Chicago after some turbulent years in New York. He marries his sweetheart, and at first he tries to go on the straight and narrow. He moves to Baltimore, it seems, to be an accountant for a local firm. But in 1920, his father dies, and he has to come back and take over as, the paterfamilias, to look after the family because his older brothers aren't really taking care of things. And he then goes back to work at the Harvard Inn. And it's in the Harvard Inn that he makes a critical mistake. He beats up the wrong person. He beats up Arthur Finnegan, who is a member of the Irish White Handers, that are a rival gang that are feuding, particularly with Frankie Yale. Now, knowing that the Irish White Handers are going to get back at him, Yale tells him, you need to get out of town. And Capone does so. He goes over to Chicago at the invitation of Johnny Torrio and sort of moves out there in 1921.
Contrary to many people's beliefs, Capone was not forced to leave New York in 1919. He left voluntarily. He left because he was invited to go to Chicago by terrible Johnny Torrio. He'd known Torrio as a member of the 5 Points gang, and Torrio was working now for Big Jim Colosimo. Jim Colosimo, Diamond Jim, was the owner of a massive brothel empire, anywhere up to 200 brothels in Chicago. And he was being bribed by a Black Hand gang. Black Hand gangs are extortionists. They had once before bribed Colosimo, but at this point in time, he's really quite frightened, and this time they're getting close to him. So what he needs some muscle to come in and defeat this Black Hand gang. And Torrio can't do this on his own. He calls on Capone, who comes over and very effectively manages to destroy, largely through brutality, the Black Hand gang in question. When Capone has finished this and rises up through the ranks of Colosimo and Torrio's gang, legend has it that he really wants to shift the whole business into another gear. The Volstead Act has come into law on the 20th of January 1920, and Capone realizes that this is where the really big money is going to lie. There's almost unlimited demand, there is ease of production. Anyone who can actually get on the right side of this can make an almighty amount of money. So he tries to persuade Colosimo that this is the way forward. Colosimo won't see it that way, and legend has it that between the two of them, Torrio and Capone kill Colosimo and take over his empire.
Chicago was a very rapidly growing city. Unlike New York, it was a relatively new city. And because it had grown so quickly in such a short amount of time, the city was particularly rife with problems. So growing so quickly meant there were plenty of opportunities to develop small little communities, fiefdoms, in which individual people could take over. Authorities had a lot of difficulty maintaining control over these new wards, over these new sort of areas. And so Chicago developed a reputation of being what's referred to as an open town, a place in which various forms of vice, while not legal, were definitely allowed to sort of continue as long as they didn't arouse too much attention and as long as they got their kickback from the local criminals.
The Roaring Twenties is really the idea of the consumer culture gone wild.
After a brief recession in the aftermath of the First World War, it is a period of unprecedented economic expansion. Stocks are up, development is up, there's land booms in Florida and other places. Everything seems to be on the up and up. And there's an explosion not just in sort of economic sense, but also in the cultural sense.
We're looking at America really having its party decade. Bathtub gin, flappers. The idea that America really is rolling at this point.
A lot of music coming to the fore, a lot of jazz. Of course, people like Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, all these big names that we now recognize as leading lights of the jazz movement are coming up during the 1920s. A lot of writers, most famous, of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald, but Ernest Hemingway, a lot of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance, like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, are starting to sort of make their names during this period. It really is a decade in which it feels as if nothing can be stopped, as if everything is going to keep roaring.
We don't have to look much further than looking at Hollywood. I mean, look at the recent film Babylon. which describes it so well. Look at The Great Gatsby. These are ideas of conspicuous consumption. The hero of this era is the person who can throw money around like mad. And that's one of the reasons why Capone fits into this idea so well. Prohibition is the outlawing of the production, the importation, or the sale of alcohol. It's the result of the 18th Amendment, which is passed in 1919, and it becomes American law on the 20th of January 1920.
But it was a long time coming because it was the result of a concerted campaign by various temperance organizations that had been ongoing since the mid-19th century.
The idea behind it is that America can create an alcohol-free country. Without alcohol, wives will not be battered by drunken husbands. Those husbands won't spend all the household's money. Business will not suffer because people are hungover and they can't work. The religious lobbies are pushing for this idea that alcohol is wrong. It's just immoral.
All of this comes to a head during the First World War, in which, because of wartime demands, they ban a lot of the production of alcohol to make sure that all the cereals, all the grains that are used to produce a lot of alcohol are used for the war.
When Prohibition comes in the early 1920s, it's quite popular. People think, right, okay, here we go. We are the great country of the world. We are the country that will lead the world away from its dependency on alcohol. America's always been a hard drinking country. And this idea that they can actually stop this rot, or so they feel, is taken up fairly enthusiastically by most people in the early 1920s. By the mid-1920s, the situation has changed. Americans see prohibition as a license for illegality. No one takes much notice of the law. Alcohol consumption actually goes up during prohibition. What we see is a great change in the mid-1920s away from support for prohibition to hatred of prohibition.
So a speakeasy is a venue that serves alcohol illegally, and they take a variety of different sort of forms. Some of them look just like an open saloon. In a town in which they received police protection, there was no need to hide things. Others were more fancy.
In the speakeasy, because there was no law controlling it, we see far more women, we see often racial mixing, we see the emergence of a drug culture. If you're breaking the law to drink, why not break the law to do something that's going to give you more of a buzz? The ideas behind speakeasies, the influence of speakeasies on American culture in the 1920s are difficult to overestimate, really.
Al Capone's first job in Chicago was, he was a bouncer again. He was the bouncer of the Four Deuces, which was a venue on South Wabash Street. Most of its income stream wasn't actually alcohol at the time. It was actually prostitution. That was a lot more profitable. But pretty soon he takes over bigger managerial duties. He becomes the bookkeeper. He becomes various other things. And most interestingly, Al Capone was actually very ashamed of his time at the Four Deuces because prostitution was such a big income stream for them. He did not want to be associated with prostitution in general, and he really resented when anyone referred to him as a pimp or as someone working in that particular industry.
The real change in organised crime in the 1920s comes not so much from people like Capone, but the way in which police, law courts, politicians are all bribed. The whole point of the bootleggers industry is to keep the police off his back, and he does that by paying them off. Most speakeasies were paying off large amounts of law enforcement. They would make sure that they stayed open because they paid off the police not to raid them. It's interesting, George Remus, a very, very strange man who controlled bootlegging in Cincinnati, is perhaps the best example of people being paid off. He was paying so much money that he eventually said that there wasn't enough money in the United States to pay off all the people that he needed to pay off.
Johnny Torrio is an Italian gangster. He's older than Capone, and in 1909, he actually leaves New York to go to Chicago at the invitation of Big Jim Colosimo. He runs several brothels and several legal businesses in Chicago, and he's recently been the threat of various extortion rackets, and Johnny Torrio is invited to help clear him up because Colosimo's wife is Johnny Torrio's aunt. When Capone needs somewhere to go, it's actually Frankie Yale that recommends that Torrio invite Capone out there, and they develop a very close relationship because Capone is a trusted fellow, he works quite hard, and he brings his brothers with him, Ralph and Frank, who are also quite effective. They are quite big, they're burly, they're intimidating, and they get things done. The most prominent example of this is their takeover of the town Cicero, where Frank and Al in particular helped to secure the election of the local Republican mayor who was about to be unseated in a very bloody sort of affair, and they managed to create a small community outside of Chicago where they can basically run things however they like. So Al Capone becomes Johnny Torrio's confidant, his right-hand man in the period around sort of 1923, 1924. Torrio leaves Chicago in January 1925 because he fears for his life. This all comes about because of Dean O'Banion. Dean O'Banion tricks Torrio and sets him up. He basically tells Torrio, hey, we can set up a great deal, and if you pay me, I will sort of secure a bunch of alcohol for you. And Torrio actually pays him $500,000. But when he shows up at the Seabird Brewery, he finds 20 policemen there that Dean O'Banion had sent ahead. He is left out of pocket and under investigation. He is eventually sort of indicted. And for most of his life, Johnny Torrio had avoided violence. He only really sort of employed violence when he needed to. He much preferred to sort of share things, but he was sick of Dean O'Banion and the North Side Gang. So in November 1924, he has Frankie Yale and a few others walk into Dean O'Banion's flower shop and shoot him right then and there. The remnants of the North Side Gang, of course, seek revenge. These include people like Jaime Weiss. And in January 1925, there are 2 attempts on his life. And at the end of 1925, he just leaves, he moves to Italy. He will come back a little bit later in the decade, but he decides he doesn't want to deal with it anymore. And this is perfect for Capone because there is a lot of room in Chicago right now for him to move in. With the North Side Gang weakened, he can now move from his base in Cicero, which was where a lot of his operation was sort of moving in, into more formal centers in Chicago and start taking over. There were very few challengers left over after Johnny Torrio left, so it was just a matter of knocking a few of them out, trying to form alliances, and he could take over most of the city.
What's important about Capone is that he's extraordinarily headline grabbing. He loves the limelight. Any idea of when a camera appears, he jumps into it. When a microphone appears, he shoves his face straight into it. He can't resist it. We don't know why, but that's just the nature of the man.
Of course, other gangsters had talked to the press before, but none had really tried to control their public image in the same way that Capone did. Capone was always very witty. He was always quite courteous to journalists, and of course it helped quite a bit that he bribed a few of them. He orchestrated his public image in a way that no other criminal had before. In the past, people like Jesse James had legends about them, but these were legends created after they died. Al Capone is there crafting his own image as this businessman who is being harangued for doing something that no one really thought was a crime and that everyone wanted him to do anyways.
We have criminals who dress like businessmen, who behave like businessmen, who run their businesses like businessmen. They realize that violence is actually going to only attract attention. It's not going to necessarily get them anywhere, so do everything in an understated way. Make sure that you can stay away from the gaze of the law, and if you can't, buy them off.
There's a very famous example of how he orchestrates his public image when in 1927, Tony the Greek is found dead and shot in the street, and he decides to hold a press conference in his house on Prairie Avenue. And he welcomes journalists into his house wearing an apron and slippers and holding a wooden spoon, and he invites them in for a home-cooked meal. He doesn't cook it, his mother Teresa does, but he wines and dines them and makes sure that they all understand that he's just a family man, he's just a businessman. No other criminal in the past has ever taken such care in ensuring that public opinion was decidedly on his side.
In keeping with Capone's evolution from gang member to gangster, we see his dress sense change quite dramatically. He starts off extremely flamboyantly, dressing in very, very bright colours, showing off the fact that he's a member of a particular gang. And as he leaves the 5 Points and goes to Chicago, so his style changes. Colosimo dressed extremely flashily. His nickname, Diamond Jim, came from the fact that he wore massive great diamond rings. Capone adopts this when he arrives in Chicago, but as he becomes more and more his own boss, as he becomes a more and more important businessman in Chicago, he starts to adopt a much more elegant, a much less flamboyant style. He's famous for adopting the fedora hat, for wearing the overcoat. This is Capone's trademark, but actually it's pretty understated by comparison with many other characters. And certainly you can work out the level of the member of a gang from the clothes that they wear. The foot soldiers are pretty flashily dressed. As you get to the top, they become more and more expensive and elegant and understated.
So Hollywood changed dramatically in the 1920s. Most obviously, of course, was the expansion of Hollywood businesses. More and more films were being made, but then also the consolidation of Hollywood around particular movie producers and movie distributors. This meant that there was a lot of sort of monopolizing and control in this one particular place.
These are the years where Hollywood really starts to make an impact on American culture.
Celebrities become something that a lot of Americans are very interested in, and a lot of these celebrities are either movie stars or sports stars.
We're looking at a very, very big and important industry. And this important industry realizes that one of the most attractive of characters to portray on the silver screen is the gangster.
Hollywood definitely glamorizes the gangster, but only to a certain extent. In all of those films, the gangster ends up losing. The problem was that that was not how a lot of Americans saw these films. What they took from it was that they were in fact being glamorized. And a lot of people were very concerned about that, about what it was saying about our youth.
Warner Brothers are turning out 3 gangster films a month. The gangster is portrayed as a Robin Hood character, he's portrayed as a glamorous character, he's portrayed as someone that people really look up to.
Even during his lifetime, we have films like Scarface that pretty much are based on his life. Because in a lot of ways, he provides the archetype for the gangster film.
Give me a break. I never did anything to anybody. I never hurt anybody.
Nah, you get somebody else to do it for you.
Oh. Wait. Don't! Don't come back! Don't!
In the 1920s, a lot of people regarded the gangster as a hero. This is definitely a part of American culture today. I mean, if you think of gangster rap, the way in which the person who sticks it to the man is seen as a hero. Imagine in the 1920s, you can't even go and get a drink. If you want to get a drink, the bootlegger is your hero, he's your savior. This idea is important of its own, in its own right. But what's really more important with the gangster over these times is the fact that he's now portrayed as a way of getting out of ordinary life. A life less ordinary is what the gangster represents. The gangster represents someone who works for himself, someone who's not afraid of authority, someone who does things in his own way. And if that leads to a certain amount of violence, most people consider that to be just part of the American culture as well. The gangster is extraordinarily glamorized. If we look at Hollywood, we have major stars playing gangsters. We have major stars being made by roles as gangsters, perhaps most notably Edward G. Robinson for his portrayal of a figure based loosely on Capone in Little Caesar. These characters are the people that everyone wants to be. Children want to grow up to be someone like Capone. They want to grow up to have the lifestyle of Capone. They want to have his own ability to set his own agenda. They don't want to be told what to do. Women want to be seen with Capone. They like the idea of this slightly dangerous character.
The Roosevelt administration was in some ways picking up from Hoover administration, who was receiving increasing pressure to try and do something with crime. Now, the problem is, of course, that the federal government does not have jurisdiction when it comes to most crimes. Things like murder, things like kidnapping, and various other things, those are the purview of state law enforcement. There were, at that point in time, very few crimes that were under the purview of federal authorities. But as cars became more widely available, as higher power guns were becoming more available, the government was more and more concerned that local state authorities could not deal with them. And in particular, they were worried that local state authorities, local police, could be corrupted. And so they start investing more and more money into the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, and they start pushing for legislation that will expand the list of federal crimes to include a broader range of things, including, for instance, the interstate kidnapping sort of act that emerges after the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. And in tandem with that, we had the development of the Hays Code. Now, the Hays Code is quite interesting because it's not a government code. This isn't something the government sort of sets out. It's actually something that the Hollywood industry puts together out of fear that if they don't actually start censoring their own films, that someone else will. The Hays Code is adopted in 1930, but only really starts to be enforced in 1934, and it includes a list of guidelines of things that cannot be presented in a lot of these films. So that would include, for instance, the inner thigh of a female character was not supposed to be shown. Narcotics were not supposed to be shown. Any storyline in which the police were defeated were not supposed to be shown. And the films that were produced after the Hays Code are dramatically different. One of the most interesting examples is, of course, G-Man, that features James Cagney, the star of Public Enemy, who goes from playing the gangster to playing the federal agent.
Good, he's in there. Special agent. Yes, sir. Hey.
How is she?
I don't think she has a chance.
Jean. Jean.
Rick. You've got to get there. Garage. 809 Allen Street. Brad's got the McCord girl in his car.
The Hays Code in some ways swaps the heroes around. The hero is now the federal or the local policeman who puts his life on the line to try and defend America and its society.
What sums up Capone's popularity in the 1920s is actually a book that was published in 1930 by a chap called Fred Pasley. This is called Al Capone, the biography of a self-made man. And that's exactly what the general public saw Capone as. Here was a man who didn't really play by the rules, who actually got away with it, who was capable of living life on his own terms. Capone's popularity stemmed a lot from the fact that he actually couldn't resist a camera. He was always making comments on everything from who was going to win the World Series to who should be the next president. He was an extraordinary man in that respect. But on the other hand, he was also in the papers because he was associated with acts of violence. Capone was definitely a figure to be watched in the 1930s. It's rather extraordinary because there were other much more successful gangsters than Capone, but Capone loved the limelight and he was the one who really sought it out.
By the end of the 1920s, with the North Side Gang on the run and a lot of the sort of other rivals in Chicago gone, he has a lot of financial control. You know, he challenges the local chief of police to try and arrest him. He even shows up at the police station and says, "Arrest me if you have any evidence that I've done something wrong." So he's got a lot of bravado in that sort of sense. But I don't think he has a lot of ego because throughout that latter stages, particularly after 1929, he is repeatedly trying to retire. He tries to move out to Los Angeles, and there the mayor sort of runs him out of town. He tries to move down to Miami, but again, Miami authorities harass him. After 1929, he's making a lot of moves that seem to indicate that he does not want to stay in this life, probably because he had so many assassination attempts against him over his life. So I don't think his ego was out of control. If anything, he was trying to pull back. The problem was, because he was the head, it was very difficult for him to actually pull back. And it was, in fact, too late for him to do so because authorities were already on his case. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre is the culmination of a 5-year feud between the outfit and the North Side gang.
This is perhaps one of the defining points of Capone's career.
Al Capone is sick of the assassination attempts. They try and get him in his favorite restaurant by pouring acid in his soup, but the chef snitches and tells Capone. They try and get him in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which was back then an open town in which criminals sort of went for a little vacation. And he was absolutely sick of the North Side gang and its remnants coming after him. So he, ostensibly, we don't actually know if he did arrange for it, sends his men after Bugs Moran. Bugs Moran's men are lured into a trap, and the lookout thinks that Bugs Moran is amongst this particular group, but it turns out that he wasn't. And Capone's men stop them, dressed as police officers. The 7 men are lined up against the wall. It seems like they're about to get frisked, and instead, Thompson submachine guns are used against them. They are mowed down in a brutal fashion.
All of it!
Photographers rush the scene and capture some iconic images that are plastered all over the press and which outrage the American public.
The way in which Capone manages to escape this particular incident, the way in which no one is actually imprisoned for this, no one is actually caught directly for the Valentine's Day Massacre, is interesting. It probably indicates that people had been paid off. It also indicates the incompetence of the police by comparison with how they will behave in the 1930s. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in many ways, is a watershed in American criminal history.
Public opinion had always been a little bit divided on Al Capone. For most Americans, the gangland killings were not that notable because the people being killed were criminals. For a lot of them, they felt this was their comeuppance. And for a long time, the press had balanced these accounts of gangland killings with those discussions of Capone's day out at the baseball, or, what he had bought, or where he had been pictured, his involvement with significant figures in Chicago. And of course, there was variance. The editorials were usually quite scathing of Al Capone. They were ashamed of him. But after 1929, things definitely shift. Those photos are very gruesome. They demonstrate the full brutality of the attack. This wasn't just an execution, it was a wholesale massacre.
The Valentine's Day Massacre really spurs into action a group called the Secret Six. The Secret Six are a collection of businessmen, lawyers, and academics who decide that this has gone too far, that the image of Chicago is being so badly tarnished that something has to be done. And they really work behind the scenes to try to get the federal government to act against Capone. And in fact, the federal government, they succeed. They persuade President Hoover. Every morning, apparently, he says, "We must get Capone." So what we see is a shift in the attitude towards Capone. Capone becomes public enemy number one. Capone is the target that must be eliminated.
So the business community in Chicago had, for a very long time, been quite unhappy with the reputation that Capone and other gangs were garnering for Chicago. It made it very difficult to do business in Chicago. It brought disrepute to the city, that the city's reputation was in the mud. Chicago was known not just nationally, but globally as Capone's town, and they couldn't stand for that. They really did not like this. And they also didn't like the fact that one of the reasons why Capone was able to do this was because of the cooperation of the local city authorities and the police. It's not just that Capone was running around shooting people, it's that he was allowed to do that by the city of Chicago, and they wanted to make sure that that changed.
Capone was so flash, and most people were really feeling the pinch by 1931. We've had the Wall Street crash, realization that the policies that Hoover is instigating are not working, and we're heading well into depression, into new territory. And the interesting thing about the Great Depression is it's by no means the worst depression that America's been through, but it's given a dynamism by the fact that the 1920s have been such a boom time. People are used to that, and now suddenly the plug has been pulled on the American economy and people are in free fall. They don't know where this is going to end up. They don't know how it's going to play out. A man who's buying incredibly expensive shirts, who's spending more money on his meat bill each week than probably most Americans earn in an entire year. This is ridiculous, and people really don't take to it anymore. Capone's star has waned.
Just after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in May 1929, he goes to Atlantic City to this big conference where a number of other big crime bosses are meeting. The meeting is to carve up various territories and make agreements between different factions, and it's got a lot of prominent people there, Lucky Luciano, Mayor Lansky, and a bunch of other sort of people. It's a quite significant sort of meeting. But at that meeting, a lot of the other gangsters also express their displeasure at Capone. They're quite annoyed at him for having sort of orchestrated the massacre. And so he decides, like Torrio, to try and sort of cool things off. So on his return back, he stops over in Philadelphia, and he is arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. Now, the interesting thing is that by all accounts, it seems as if he made sure he was caught with a concealed weapon so that he could spend a year in a cushy prison while things died down and heat dispersed a little bit. So it was very hard to convict Capone of anything for several different reasons. First of all was the fact that most of the crimes he committed were state-level crimes. Things like murder, things like kidnapping, things like racketeering. As long as they didn't cross state lines, and in most cases they didn't, a lot of these things would be handled by state authorities. And because Capone had such leeway, should we say, with the local police because of his extensive bribery networks and the fact that whenever a case was brought before him, evidence disappeared, the jury got bribed, all these different sort of things, it was very difficult to pin practically any of those big crimes on him. But it's also got to do with the fact that he was quite good at hiding his assets and hiding his role within the movement. His name did not appear on any of the ledgers. All of the property that he owned was under other people's names. So he has a lot of money, but none of it is in his name. He kept saying that he got his money from business, that people lent him money, that people did this, that people did that. And so it's actually very difficult to pin him down. He doesn't actually do a lot of the things that he's accused of. So it's very difficult to say that he's moved alcohol across state lines because it's usually his underlings that are doing these things. It's very difficult to say that he did something like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre precisely because he's in Florida at the time. So he has alibis for everything. He tries to keep his hands clean wherever he can. And the federal government simply does not have the jurisdiction to catch him for most of the things he's being accused of.
So the general thinking is that he's tried for tax evasion because that's the one thing that they can get him for. And this idea is very prominent in American thinking. Capone has pushed things too far. Generally, we look at this and we say, well, he's just done for tax evasion. Actually, doing him for tax evasion is a brilliant policy. You think about it. If you're an American in 1931 and you're paying your taxes, and here's this man who you've been told is making anything up to $100 million a year, and he's not paying his taxes, do you still think of him as a hero? The chances are you don't. You probably think, well, why should I pay my taxes when he doesn't? So the idea of doing him for tax evasion is actually extremely clever. Not only that, but it's very easy to quantify, or relatively easy to quantify. And his brother has actually been done for tax evasion already. So it's not a novel technique, but it's a very effective one.
Up to that point in time, a lot of criminals were vouching on the idea that the Fifth Amendment protected them from this. The Fifth Amendment says you are not legally obliged to reveal anything that is incriminating to yourself, and they argued that if they filed tax returns, they would be admitting that they were involved in illicit activities. That argument is quashed in 1927 with the case of United States v. Sullivan, where the Supreme Court essentially determines that no, in fact, you do have to file tax returns on all income, whether it's illicit or not, and the protections of the Fifth Amendment do not apply. The US government then decides to go after some low-level criminals who are not very good at record keeping, which includes Ralph Capone, try and get him sort of first. And it's that where they will develop the experience to go after Al Capone himself. Frank J. Wilson is an agent of the Bureau of Revenue Service, or the enforcement arm of the IRS. And in 1929, Andrew Mellon, the head of the Treasury at the instruction of Hoover and others, basically tells him to catch Capone. Now, he uses forensic accounting to try and find any mistakes that Al Capone makes that might reveal and might tie him to the thousands of documents that they have recovered from various raids over the years. Now, there are thousands of documents they have to look through, and Al's name does not appear on pretty much any of them, except for one. In 1926, after the assistant DA, David McSwiggan, is killed in a very bizarre case, the government raids the Hawthorne smoke shop and takes one of the ledgers there. And in one of the ledgers, the initials for several high-ranking members of the outfit, including Al, appear. And a very clear indication of how much money he's receiving, where the money is going, and all the rest of it. This is a very important sort of find, but it's still circumstantial. So Frank J. Wilson has to do much more to ensure he has a solid case. He needs someone to actually say, these initials stand for Al Capone and for other people like Ralph. And so they decide to go after various people who worked at the organization at the time. So in other words, 1925 to around 1927. They managed to find 2 accountants. And they use some very underhanded tactics to get them to turn state's evidence. With the first one, they learn that he has a phobia of insects, so Wilson keeps him in a cell filled with cockroaches and various other insects until he turns. The other, they find thanks to Eddie O'Dare, who is an informant. They trace him down to Miami, they corner him when nobody's looking, and they basically intimate that if he doesn't turn state's evidence, they're going to release him very publicly, and when the outfit sees that, they're going to kill him to make sure that they tie up all loose ends. So with the ledger and the witnesses that can corroborate that this initial is in fact Al Capone, they can finally determine, Frank J. Wilson can finally sort of state clearly that there is money being made, that Al Capone actually received that money, and that as a result, he did not file an income tax return. Capone definitely thought he could get off lightly. In part, he thought so because his brother Ralph Capone had only received 3 to 5 years and had only served a few of those. From the moment he knows this is coming about, he starts to make moves to try and settle the case. And it's in that process that he makes a critical mistake. In 1930, his tax attorney, James Mattingly, arranges a meeting between Al Capone and members of the IRS. Now, the IRS tells him very clearly at the beginning of that interview that everything he says can and will be used against him in court, the basic sort of precursor to the Miranda rights. His attorney, James Mattingly, then follows this by saying, well, actually, we're only going to speak if this isn't used against us. That is never agreed upon, and then Capone essentially spills his guts, explains various different things about his life. He doesn't answer everything, but he makes that mistake because he thinks that if he is frank at this stage, he can cut a deal, he can get a reduced sentence, he can get a cushy cell like the one he had in Philadelphia and just ride it out for a few years. He might even sort of benefit from it because the heat might die down a little bit. Capone decides to set up a plea bargain with the prosecution. The prosecution agrees to that. For a reduced sentence, he will plead guilty. And they present that recommendation to the judge, James Wilkerson. But James Wilkerson is having none of that. That is just an advisory sort of proposal. He decides to reject it, and as such, Capone immediately withdraws his guilty plea and the trial starts. At the start of the trial, James Wilkerson makes sure that the jury is untampered with. He's received word from Eddie O'Dare, who is the plant within the Chicago outfit, informing on them for the government that the jury pool for his trial had actually been bribed already. So he decides to switch jury pools with a neighboring trial that was starting the same day. Now, this would ensure that the people who were selected had never been bribed, and to ensure that remained the case, he sequestered that jury, which wasn't very typical at the time. Capone got 11 years, mostly because Judge James Wilkerson was really out to get him. This was evident throughout the trial, so he really does throw the book at him. Capone had been expecting, maybe 3 to 5 years, with basically only 2 if he behaved himself, but 11 was quite a lot more than he was expecting. On top of that, of course, he had to pay fines to get back a lot of the money that he hadn't declared in the first place.
Talk about excitement at the county jail. It's finally come to pass, and here's the proof. Mr. Alphonse Capone, alias Mr. Al Brown, alias the Big Shot, has met the enemy, and he is theirs, on his way to the Dearborn Street Station, with an escort that'll do credit to a sultan. It won't be long now before the world's most notorious gangster will only be an offensive memory. And if he behaves himself while he's the guest of Uncle Sam in Atlanta, he'll be out again in only 7.5 years. And so, up until 1940, Mr. Capone will be Mr. 40,886.
He wasn't actually going to go to Atlanta Penitentiary for his trial first. At least he didn't think so. He was initially intending to go to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, and he was really looking forward to that because his associates, Frank Needy and others, were based there, and he'd heard that the warden gave him the run of the mill. But on the day he was due to be moved, and over the radio, he and his family hear that he's actually being moved to Atlanta. He makes his way down south to Atlanta, and there are a number of different rumors that say that he lived a very cushy life. But these are all produced by the media, a media that had a keen interest in sort of presenting him as being sort of someone who was running things. They had developed that narrative over many years, and so they continued to play into it. A lot of prisoners who were in Atlanta at the time also fed into that mythology. But the reality is that based on every available piece of evidence that we have, he pretty much lived like any other prisoner. He shared a cell with other people, he didn't receive any special visitation rights, and he only got the standard $10 commissary that everyone else got at the time. The only thing was extraordinary about him was his reputation, which meant that he was often the object of a lot of sort of attention from his fellow inmates who would harass him. But Capone tried to stay on the good side of prison wardens because he knew that if he was on good behavior, he would get a reduced sentence.
After a year there, he was transferred to Alcatraz.
Alcatraz is an island in San Francisco Bay. It is not very far from the mainland. It is visible, but it is impossible to get to. The strong currents in that area mean that they did not need very high walls to keep the prisoners in there. It was going to be a model prison. It was going to be a prison where the biggest public enemies could be held. And in the time that Capone was there, he was sharing that prison with some very prominent criminals of the period, people like Machine Gun Kelly, people like Alvin Creepy Karpis, people like Doc Arthur Barker. And he was moved there for a number of different reasons. First of all, because he had been public enemy number one. The government wanted people to know that he was going to the place where all the worst prisoners went. But it's also because those stories about him having a cushy time in Atlanta were so widespread, the government wanted to nip those in the bud and send him to the place where they could be sure none of it was happening.
He was involved in quite a nasty incident where he was stabbed by a fellow inmate. He was prisoner number 85. He was no longer Capone. Alcatraz is grim. It is cold, it's dank, and there's no, apparently at this point in time, there was no way out of it. It was the new top security prison.
Al Capone contracted syphilis, we believe, in his teenage years. We even believe that May and Sonny, his son, both had it as a result of him. So he might have got it when he was a teenager. It is a degenerative disease. It gets significantly worse and reaches the neurological stage after a certain point in time, and that can severely reduce your mental capacity. It has a lot of physical deterioration as well, to the point that in February 1938, or around then, Capone absolutely collapses on his way to breakfast and has to be hospitalized. He is even kept in the mental health ward during his time in Alcatraz to try and get into recovery. He talks to himself. There's even a well-known case where he is flinging feces at a fellow prisoner. He is starting to lose it as a result of the syphilis. The last few years of his life are relatively well documented because he doesn't really get up to much. The initial assessments after he comes out of prison demonstrate, according to the doctors at the time, that his mental capacity had deteriorated to that of a 12-year-old. He's not really able to rejoin the outfit. His brother Ralph tries to get him to sort of do a few things here and there, but by that point in time, Ralph Capone is not the center of the outfit, so he has very little pull. So he spends most of his time in Palm Isle, his property in Miami. He fishes, he goes out to dinner, but he doesn't really do much while he's out of prison. Capone dies in 1947. He first has a stroke, but eventually has a heart attack. He dies surrounded by his family. It's a relatively sort of low-key affair. The funeral is surrounded by journalists, but not that many people attend because by that point in time, Al Capone had been fading light. In the last years of his life, there's a very famous line by one of his former associates who said he was as nutty as a fruitcake. So he does not receive the same sort of attention that he did at the very height of his career when he dies.
Capone's legacy is a peculiar one. There's no real reason why a relatively minor figure in terms of bootlegging has become such an iconic figure. I would argue that Capone's legacy really is because he loved fame. He wanted to be famous. Capone can't resist jumping in front of a camera. He can't resist speaking into a microphone. He can't resist hanging out with famous people. He can't resist making a quip about how ineffectual the police are. In many ways, he's famous because he's a big mouth. But that serves a lot of purposes for the law enforcement as well. So law enforcement like to big up Capone. They like to make him appear far more important than he really is. If you consider that they bring him to justice in 1931, well, if you bring someone to justice who is actually a fairly minor figure, big deal. But if you bring the kingpin, public enemy number one, to justice, suddenly the finance that you want to get to expand your little law enforcement empire grows. The publicity you get grows. The bigger the bust, the bigger the fame, the bigger the rewards. So we can see that Capone is famous because people wanted him to be famous.